a Pop Original Series.
Hi everyone, welcome to my lecture on the budget balance. When a government uses fiscal policy to fix short-run issues, there are long-run consequences. And one of those consequences is racking up a budget deficit, which, if prolonged, results in public debt, meaning the government owes money to the public, which can include individuals, businesses, or other governments. So let's dive in. Is fiscal policy a short or long-term treatment? Answer now. It is a short-term treatment. As you can see from the graph on the right, it's used to shift aggregate demand to the right. Remember, fiscal policy is always used to shift AD. But using fiscal policy has long-term consequences because it requires the government to spend money. Here's an example of this concept. If we have a recessionary gap, the government can use fiscal policy by spending money to get out of it. But in the long run, what do we end up with? A budget deficit. So here's a key concept that you read about, the budget balance. The budget balance is calculated as follows: taxes minus government spending minus transfers. So let's look at taxes. The government collects taxes from its citizens. Two big examples are sales tax and property tax. You guys have paid sales tax before if you've bought anything, and the sales tax goes to the government. The property tax is paid by your parents, assuming they own their own homes instead of renting. And that property tax goes to the local and state government, which then decides how to spend the tax revenue. Let's look at government spending. Here are two examples of government spending. When we had new furniture last year, that's an example of the government spending money. And let's say there's potholes on Willow Road. That would be an example of government spending. Here are two examples of transfers. One would be unemployment checks. Another would be the fact that every adult got a $1,200 check. So actually a few weeks ago, I got a $1,200 check from the US government. Okay, so as you can see, if the government collects more in taxes than it spends, it has a surplus. But if it spends more than it collects in tax revenue, it then runs a deficit. Okay, but now I have a question for you. Let's say Africa has a budget deficit. Does this mean their government definitely engaged in discretionary fiscal spending and collected less in taxes than it spent? No. It does not. Why is that? Well, the reason is because of automatic stabilizers. Here's a quick review of automatic stabilizers. These are spending rules that cause the economy to be automatically contractionary during inflationary times, and on the flip side, cause the economy to automatically expand during recessionary times. This is not the same as discretionary fiscal policy. Let's look at two examples. The first one would be a graduated income tax. So when the economy is in an inflationary period and people are all employed and making lots of money, they then have jobs and pay higher taxes. Higher taxes mean more revenue for the government, which automatically contribute to a budget surplus, or on the other hand, would shrink a budget deficit. But the opposite can happen. So here's a real-life example. The picture at the right is one of me and my friend Ashley. She's a dentist. And right now, since we're all in quarantine, she's not working, so her income has decreased. This means she is paying less income tax, when originally she'd be paying a lot of income tax because she makes a lot more money than I do. And so, since she's paying less income tax, this automatically worsens the budget deficit because the government is collecting less in tax revenue. Sorry, I went on too soon. The second example would be unemployment insurance. So right now we're in a recession, so more and more people are receiving unemployment insurance. And remember, this is an automatic stabilizer, so it's going to automatically affect the budget by making it worse. So to summarize this concept, remember that automatic stabilizers affect the budget balance even without the government using any discretionary fiscal spending. And during a recession, automatic stabilizers cause the budget balance to decrease or go negative and move towards a deficit. And why is this? Well, during this time, income tax revenue will go down and unemployment payments will go up. Let's do a quick learning check. So answer these questions. Okay, let's go over the answers. Fiscal policies are short-term policies. They shift aggregate demand. Remember, Keynes was the economist who advocated for the use of discretionary fiscal policy because during the Great Depression, economists were using the monetary policy by lowering interest rates, and it wasn't doing enough. And so Keynes argued that there wasn't time to wait for the economy to self correct and that the government needed to stimulate the economy now, since in the long run, we are all dead. Number two, the answer is it does not indicate whether or not Congress has engaged in discretionary fiscal policy. The presence of automatic stabilizers, right, are going to also affect the budget balance. Finally, if we begin from a balanced budget, ceteris paribus, surpluses will automatically occur during an expansion. All right. So now you've learned that the budget balance is affected by both the business cycle and the existence of automatic stabilizers. Does this mean the budget balance is a misleading indicator of our economy's health? The answer is no. We actually have something called the cyclically adjusted budget balance. It is the budget balance that's recalculated assuming the economy is at potential real GDP. So here's the formula for the budget balance. Now, assume the economy is in an inflationary gap. If we were to calculate the cyclically adjusted budget balance, we need to pretend to move the economy to potential GDP. So I picture shifting that inflationary short run gap and closing it and shifting the economy to the left back to where long run aggregate supply would be on an ASAB graph. So if we were at potential GDP, would tax revenues be higher or lower? Well, tax revenues would be lower since the economy wouldn't be as hot. Not as many people would have jobs, and if they do have jobs, their incomes might not be as high, and so this would decrease tax revenue. So this means the cyclically adjusted budget balance would be greater or have a larger budget deficit than the one that doesn't take into account business cycles. Okay? All right, let's move on. So the next big question is, should we require an annually balanced budget? Now, if you did the reading, you would know the answer. So go ahead and answer now. Should we require an annually, can't say that word, balanced budget? The answer is no. Why? Well, it would prevent the government from spending money to fix a recession. Here's an example. Assume the economy is in a recession. What fiscal policy should we take? Well, we know we should take an expansionary fiscal policy. So we know that we should increase government spending, decrease taxes, and increase transfers. But wait a minute, folks. This would worsen a budget deficit, even though these actions are necessary for treating a recession. So this is why requiring an annually balanced budget is a bad idea. It cripples the government by preventing them from spending money to help the economy. And actually, if a government tried to reduce its deficit during a recession, it would end up using a contractionary policy during a recession, which would not make people happy. It would worsen the economy. So keeping that all in mind, let's acknowledge the fact that persistent budget deficits are problematic, though. So here are 3 reasons why persistent budget deficits are a problem. First, it causes crowding out. Remember, crowding out occurs when the government borrows money, and this affects the demand for loanable funds by shifting the demand curve to the right, which increases the interest rate. Second, persistent budget deficits create a massive amount of interest that the government also needs to pay back. The third reason is that people stop lending to governments when they feel the government is unable to pay them back. And this makes it difficult for governments to be able to use discretionary policy when they need it because no one's going to lend them money anymore. So again, no more discretionary fiscal policy. So here's a real-world example of a government that found itself in problematic, massive debt. So in 2001, Argentina defaulted on $100 billion of national debt. It was a pretty bad recession. There was a lot of political instability. Within a span of like a year, they went through 5 presidents. And also, most debtors were repaid only a third of what they were owed, meaning if the Argentinian government owed you money, you were only repaid a third of the amount of money they owed you. And so a New York financial company called NML Capital was owed over $1 billion, and they were upset that they weren't getting repaid. So they decided to steal the national treasure of the Argentinians, a big ship called El Libertad. So, guys, imagine if the US owed a Chinese financial company money and we were unable to pay them back. And that company responded by stealing the Statue of Liberty. That's basically what happened here. So, like, the Argentinian government owed people money. Some people got pissed off and stole an Argentinian ship. So, yes, persistent budget deficits are important to avoid. We're going to finish lecture with two concepts that I actually cut out of the reading to reduce your reading load because I figured I could teach it to you in lecture. The first concept is what's called the debt to GDP ratio. This is a measure used to assess how healthy an economy is. This ratio shows how large a government's debt is in proportion to its GDP. Here's a quick hypothetical example to illustrate how it's used. Let's compare America to Aruba. America has a debt of $2 billion, while Aruba has a debt of $2.5 billion. Wow, you think, America is worse off than Aruba because it has a bigger debt. But wait, let's compare the GDP of these two countries. So America has a GDP of $20 billion, while Aruba has a tiny GDP in comparison at only $4 billion. Suddenly, America's $2 billion debt number doesn't seem so bad in comparison. So, to recap, economists use the debt to GDP ratio as one way to measure how healthy an economy is. I made these numbers up. These are totally hypothetical. Here's a chart that actually illustrates this concept. As you can see, the US has a pretty bad debt to GDP ratio compared to other highly populated countries. Our debt is greater than our country's GDP, but at least we're not doing as poorly as Japan is. Okay. Here's the second concept that I cut out of your reading, which is implicit liabilities. Here's a group of people. What do you notice about them? Yes, they are all old and not diverse. Sorry, I didn't pick a diverse old person picture. They're just all old. How do these people get healthcare, assuming they are retired? How do they get healthcare insurance, is what I should have said, assuming they're retired? They are insured through Medicare. But wait, who pays for Medicare? The answer is the US government through tax revenues. This is what's called an implicit liability. It's a future spending promise made by the government that actually is not included in current debt statistics. So implicit liabilities are a concern because we have huge spending increases forthcoming, right? So coming in the future. So Medicare is a big implicit liability because we have huge spending increases forthcoming, but not a lot of young people to pay for them. So just because an economy is healthy and has a low debt to GDP ratio doesn't mean it's safe due to the existence of implicit liabilities. So think about Japan, right? They're actually in a really terrible position because they have a very low birth rate. Their young people are not replacing their old people at an equal rate. So not only do they have a terrible debt to GDP ratio, they also have a lot more old people than young people. All right, let's move on to one last learning check. Answer these questions. Okay, so the answer to question 1 is budget deficit. The answer to question 2 is recession. The answer to question 3 is automatic stabilizers. Here's your second learning check. Answer the questions. Okay, here are the answers. How do we calculate the budget balance? Well, we take tax revenue minus government spending minus transfers. Should we require annually balanced budgets? The answer is no. America has a bad debt to GDP ratio, and an implicit liability is not counted in current debt statistics. Hopefully you did well on the questions. Reach out if you have any questions, and have a nice day, everyone. Go take a walk.